Okay, something wild is happening in Bulgaria. You know what might feel like perhaps an apocalyptic scenario for many Greek people, which, yep, this is a joke that is referring to the old Bulgarian Empire. The Bulgarians have taken to the streets by the tens of thousands. I don't know how well that joke is going to land. But yes, my friends, before it is that we could finish this year in 2025, it turns out that Gen Z had one more continent to reach with protests, and probably genuinely at this point, we might actually have to cover something for Antarctica and the penguins rising up for the creation of angry feet. But yeah, if you didn't catch it in the news, the people of Bulgaria showed up for protests in the capital city of Sofia, and Gen Z would lead the way, bringing in the Gen Z fall to Europe, finally. Again, at this rate, the only continents that haven't had a Gen Z-led protest are Australia and Antarctica, which, considering the events that have happened in Australia, we could see that also taking place depending on how things turn out. We don't really know yet, necessarily. But the protests in the streets are only the symptom of a much greater problem in Bulgaria: corruption. So on today's episode, what we're going to be doing is explaining how Bulgaria got to where it is and why it is something that exposes potential problems for the EU. But in order to explain that, first we're going to have to dive into some context. Yeah, the world just feels absolutely insane right now, but, I guess it's not like everything will suddenly devolve into World War III, right? Right? Well, I really hope not, but if you yourself want to actually plan for such an occurrence and imagine yourself at the helm of a nation hell-bent on conquering the world, you can do so with today's sponsor, Supremacy World War III. Wow, holy crap, this is actually really fitting for every single thing that I cover. Yes, my friends, this is a totally free online PvP strategy game for PC, iOS, and Android, set in a time of modern global warfare. You can engage in battles, strategize, and conquer the world against real player opposition, cross-platform, and also control nations, their economy, and armies. And when I talk about this, it's not a small one-off thing either, as matches are persistent and can last quite literally weeks, with economic realities, researching over 250 different techs, and shifting alliances, all changing the balance of power until there's finally a winner, and then it starts over again and you can do what you want. Which, I have to say, is actually really cool, especially in comparison to a lot of online mobile games. But right now, there has never been a better time to jump in, as Season 19, Fractured Domination, is coming, as well as Officers. In the New World Divide domination scenario, commanders are able to battle across the globe to capture and hold valuable control points for valuable supplies. Plus, when you go and click the link down in my description, you'll get an exclusive starter pack containing one free seasonal unit, the Elite Railgun, with a value of $40 US, and that offer is valid for the next 30 days for only new players. So go and sign up today and get started on conquering the world. While it still lasts. Yay, let's see more of why it may not last. The earliest evidence of hominids occupying Bulgaria dates back from at least 1.4 million years ago. And okay, guys, no.
So many disconnects and so many unanswered questions.
No, instead, for this story, the only really thing that we have to do is head back to the defining moment in history for many Eastern European countries: the fall of the Soviet Union. In fact, arguably, I need to cover more things in Eastern Europe because it would reduce a lot of the background that I would have to do, because pretty much everything gets destroyed in World War II, and then almost every modern problem the country has comes after 1945. It would make my job a lot easier, arguably. Either way, Todor Zhivkov was in charge of Bulgaria from 1954 to 1990. A former police chief of Sofia, Zhivkov was an ardent communist and a huge supporter of the USSR. His efforts would bring about great peace and stability to Bulgaria, but that also came at the cost of Zhivkov becoming a complete lackey for the Soviets. In fact, you could say that he held the Soviets in higher regard than he did his own countrymen, and he ruled the country with an iron fist. That is simply the reality of things. And hiding just off to his side and in his shadow would be one of the main players of our story, his bodyguard, Boyko Borisov, who would later himself become prime minister around 20 years later. If we go ahead and jump then through the 1990s, we pass by a Bulgaria that was experiencing extreme social change, just like many other countries, including Russia during the 90s that were part of the Eastern Bloc. It also experienced at the same time a severe rise in corruption in numerous different sectors that, well, hasn't exactly gone away. But in order to explain how that corruption ties into the politics of Bulgaria, we need to first kind of explain how politics within Bulgaria works itself, specifically the president's role. You see, in Bulgaria, the president's role is primarily something that is more symbolic, with the main function of it being to be the arbitrator of the disputes between Bulgaria's different institutions. The president of Bulgaria is not necessarily considered the head of government or part of the nation's executive power. However, that being said, in the absence of a prime minister, presidents are in charge of appointing an interim administration, which does give them considerable influence over the government during those periods. Like, as an example of that, you have Zhelyazkov in 1994 to 1995, Petar Stoyanov in 1997, Rosen Plevnilev in 2013 and 2014, and then Rumen Radev in 2017, 2021, and since 2022, which, yes, I probably butchered the names of some of these, but it is important to stress, and that last part where you heard since 2022, that's what we're going to be focusing on here today. Also, if my sound got weird, my dog just came in here and bumped both the camera and also the microphone. What are you doing, Millie? Anyway, the president is elected for a 5-year term. It is restricted to 2 terms, even if these are non-successive. After an individual has served 2 terms as president, that individual will forever be barred from being elected to the presidency again under the rules that were set out by Bulgaria's constitution. Now, in contemporary Bulgaria, the government and its leader, the prime minister, have more political influence and significance than the president. Thus, the parliamentary elections will set the short-term social and political environment in the country, since the cabinet, which is chosen by the prime minister and approved by the parliament, decides how the country is governed, while the president can really only make suggestions and impose vetoes. In addition to all that, the president also addresses the nation on national television annually on New Year's Eve, just moments before the start of the new year. But even this division of powers couldn't really stop the encroachment of serious levels of corruption, which, yes, already existed, but had the chance to get much worse. And even the press was not excluded from being tainted by this. And that is where things start to get really murky. Because according to Reporters Without Borders, the press industry in Bulgaria is rife with, and I quote, corruption and collusion between media, politicians, and oligarchs, end quote. Media ownership is something that is opaque, it's not transparent, and it's concentrated in the hands of a few owners despite a superficial diversity in ownership. To explain how bad this got, upon joining the European Union in 2007, Bulgaria actually ranked a fairly respectable 35th on the Press Freedom Index alongside France, which, yeah, that's not the highest or top 10, but 35th out of like 180 something countries is not bad. But that ranking has since tumbled to 111th, by far the worst press freedom performer of any EU member and candidate state. More than 90% of Bulgarian journalists, as polled by the Association of European Journalists, have reported frequent interference with their work. Lawmakers have even gone as far as to threaten to fire TV journalists during live broadcasts. The media environment has been further degraded by EU funds being diverted by the government to sympathetic media outlets. So if the government goes and favors what it is that you're saying about them, then, hey, you're more likely to receive financial compensation. In 2018, 2 journalists were actually detained and later released by police while they were investigating a massive scheme to drain EU funds by a company that was associated with, if you can guess it, a number of high-profile government procurement projects. Go figure. But as it is, we are probably getting a little bit ahead of ourselves here. If we go and hop back in our metaphorical time machine, we can stop briefly in the year 2005. This being where Boyko Borisov had won the election to become the mayor of Bulgaria's capital city, Sofia. In December of 2005, Borisov would become the founding chair of Bulgaria's largest conservative political party, the Citizens for European Development of Bulgaria, more commonly known by the acronym GERB, or GERB, as I'm going to say. This role led him to grow his influence in the country's largest party, and allowed him to be GERB's lead candidate for prime minister, which he would win in 2009. So it was then, over the course of the 2010s, he would serve in this role 3 separate times, resigning each time after major protests were held against his ruling party, GERB. Electoral results for Borisov and his party were overshadowed by allegations of fraud in 2013, 2015, and in 2019, both locally and for the European Parliament. Meanwhile, opposition parties would begin to form, but they didn't exactly have enough power or cohesion yet amongst the separate groups to form a majority ruling coalition. Meanwhile, the corruption in Bulgaria was only deepening and growing in size and scale, and people were getting more and more upset. To explain this, my friends, as is very common in many communist countries and former communist countries, corruption has pretty much always been a problem. And corruption has resulted in significant economic losses and underperformance in Bulgaria. Since its ascension to the EU in 2007, it has remained the Union's poorest country, with a per capita GDP of $16,300, less than half that of the European average. By the year 2014, the Bulgarian government was accused of mismanaging the economy so badly that the European Union froze billions of euros in aid. Between 2008 and 2018, foreign direct investment would collapse, dropping from what had been around 28% to just 2% of GDP, or $9 billion to just around $1.1 billion. Truly, it was not something that was good, and the cabinets of Boyko Borisov were in power through most of the 2010s, establishing a system of impunity for high-profile crime and favoritism among certain local companies. Approximately 22% of Bulgaria's GDP is lost to corruption each year. That is how bad that is. And it's gotten so bad then that a number of major foreign companies like the CEZ Group have withdrawn from Bulgaria due to this. Even worse, this has consistently caused the rejection of Bulgaria's attempts to join the Schengen area. Now, what is the Schengen area, Stack, you may wonder? Well, that is a system of open borders that encompass 29 European countries that have officially abolished border controls at their common borders. It also functions as a single jurisdiction under a common visa policy for international travel purposes. And it's named after the 1985 Schengen Agreement, the 1990 Schengen Convention, and the location of both of these events being the town of Schengen, Luxembourg. Only 2 EU member states, Cyprus and Ireland, are not part of the Schengen area. That's it. So for there to be a problem with Bulgaria, which actually shares a land border in comparison to Ireland and Cyprus, that does not say any good things. The other rather sad legacy for Boyko Borisov was the fact that he would contribute to the rise of the political career and former media mogul and oligarch, cosplaying as a politician, Delyan Peevski, which this guy seriously pissed off a lot of Bulgarians, but we will have to get back to him later. Right now, we need to mention why the Schengen area is a good group to be a part of when you are a member of the EU. Just to give some stats, around 1.7 million people commute to work across an internal European border each day. And in some regions, these international commuters would constitute up to a third of the workforce. In 2015, there were 1.3 billion crossings of Schengen borders in total. 57 million crossings were due to the transport of goods by road, with a value of 2.8 trillion euro. The decrease in the cost of trade due to the Schengen area varies from around 0.5% to 1.5% depending on geography, trade partners, and other factors, and that doesn't sound like much, but when you are talking about things in the value of billions of dollars or euro, or trillions for that matter, a decrease by 1% is significant. In addition to that, the common visa policy of the Schengen area allows nationals of certain countries to enter the Schengen area via air, land, or sea without a visa for stays up to 90 days within a 180-day period. So, you can see how there's nothing then but benefits that come with being in the Schengen area, especially when it comes to trade, tourism, etc. It is a good thing. The problem, or the only problem I should say really for Bulgaria, is that it kept getting denied for entry because of its absolutely terrible corruption. So, even though they joined the EU in 2007, it took until January of 2025 for Bulgaria to finally be accepted into it. And in case you're wondering just how bad the corruption is and why this might give the EU pause, Bulgaria ranks second to last in the European corruption studies, just behind Hungary. That is also probably a nation we're going to have to be addressing. And in fact, I got a whole list of different countries that I want to do corruption history videos on. In fact, right now, let me know in the comment section if something that it is that you'd like to see is a video on the top 5 most corrupt countries in the world, because I think we've talked about a couple of them before in the past, but we can do one video each of like the 5th, 4th, 3rd, 2nd, and then number 1 most corrupt country. Anyway, if Bulgaria is now a part of the Schengen zone and everything is great, why is there a problem? Well, it was a new budget for the year 2026 that ended up setting the people of Bulgaria's shoelaces on fire to the point where they needed to stamp them out on the streets of Sofia. The budget would include both raises and financial perks for government officials and also raised taxes. Anger over the budget would bring out a cross-section of society, including employers' associations and trade unions, teachers, students, and Bulgaria's ethnic minorities. Which is to be expected, I guess. But the size of the protest surprised even the organizers. On 3 occasions, in just 3 weeks, the size of the demonstrations would reach tens of thousands of people and would spread to towns and cities all across the country. Things would then really take off in the first weeks of December, though, as over 100,000 people would flood the streets of Sofia in one of the largest protests the country of just 7.7 million people has ever seen. 100,000 out of 7.7 million is substantial. The most interesting dynamic of these protests was the massive presence of Gen Z Bulgarians. While Bulgarians of all ages were present at the protests, their numbers had never really included Gen Z in significant numbers, who were powerfully effective in supporting the cause, both by communication with online apps such as Discord, Snapchat, and Instagram, as well as showing up with intense amounts of anger and frustration. And besides that, another issue that the public had demanded attention for was in dealing with the individual that we spoke about here earlier, the Mr. Harvey Weinstein impersonator himself, Peevski. So yeah, anyways, Delyan Peevski is a real piece of work. Remember how we mentioned him earlier and how he'd pissed off a ton of Bulgarians? Well, we need to get into why that was in the first place. First off, Peevski had already been investigated for corruption as early as way back in 2007 when he served as the Deputy Minister for Emergencies and Disasters, which is Bulgaria's version of FEMA. Yes, as far back as 2007, Peevski was already becoming many Bulgarians' own personal pet peeve and getting investigated for such things as abuse of power and corruption. Somehow, he escaped unscathed from the investigation, after the court had previously ruled that he lacked the necessary moral qualifications for the position. He then appealed and somehow got the court to reverse said decision. Now, did a judge get mysteriously more wealthy after this ruling? Well, we can't say for sure necessarily, but Peevski would later be accused of bribery, so we shouldn't really put it past him. This guy did quite a bit. After all the research that was done on this guy, oh my god, there is a lot here. He genuinely might be the worst. Essentially, the man doesn't seem to have any positive qualities and is known nationwide in Bulgaria for being the embodiment of corruption in both government and the system of oligarchy that is present in the country. The parallels between Peevski and Harvey Weinstein really only continue because he not only abuses his power, but everyone knows that it is happening essentially and doesn't really do anything about it for decades. So, after winning the court case investigating him for corruption, Peevski went straight back to the government and won a seat as a member of parliament, or MP. He then got bounced around from committee to committee, presumably because nobody could stand working with him, though we can't really confirm that as an official reason. And the story with Peevski then veers into the realm of ridiculous with what happened next, as he, who was constantly being accused of corruption, was nominated to serve on the Anti-Corruption Commission. Yeah. Thankfully, Parliament would reject his appointment. In 2013, Peevski would be elected by 116 MPs to be the head of the State Agency for National Security. And this caused so much outrage that protests began to form in Sofia demanding his resignation from the position, with crowds chanting "Mafia" and "Resign" over and over. Shortly after this, Peevski would make a public statement saying that he would resign from his position as long as he could continue to be an MP. By this point, Peevski had grown his mother's media empire, New Bulgarian Media Group, into a media conglomerate, something that owned 6 of the 12 largest Bulgarian newspapers out of over 20 that he owned overall, as well as a monopoly on newspaper distribution and digital TV channels that cover, mind you, 80%, over 80% of Bulgaria's entire media ecosystem. Along with that, he also would own multiple construction companies and a major share owner of the largest manufacturer and seller of tobacco products in the entire country. This tobacco company would take part in the largest cigarette smuggling operation in the world and would transport cigarettes to the PKK of all people. Yeah, the Kurdistan Workers' Party had their cigarettes supplied illegally through Turkey by Peevski's tobacco company. So technically, he allied with a group on Europe's list of terrorist organizations while also serving as a member of parliament who claimed to support Bulgaria's Turkish minority. Genuinely, the conflict of interest here is kind of astounding. So it is then, my friends, that for the better part of the next decade, Peevski would abuse his power and influence to enrich himself and his fellow oligarch friends, and when questioned on it, he would just bribe people to shut them up and look the other way. This got to such a disgusting level that both the United States and the United Kingdom have placed individual economic sanctions on him. Like, yes, him as an individual businessman. As part of the effort to improve his public image after all these, Peevski would go on to sell most of his media empire and start to become one of the loudest MPs when it came to sending aid to support Ukraine. But even this couldn't erase the memories of the people. Peevski's main wins would have been an effort to keep the minority opposition parties from agreeing too much and forming a solid coalition, which he did. He's very good at doing that. In essence, he's something of an agent of chaos. This instability in the government would lead to 6 prime ministers in 7 years. And on top of that, because you can always change out your government leader, they would change out the government themselves because there would be 7 snap national elections in just 4 years. That is an insane level of turnover. And the turmoil of the Bulgarian people has just been building since the pandemic. But it really blew up in late 2025. Thus it is, my friends, when protests would begin to form in September of 2025, Peevski's name was mentioned right there next to protest chants like mafia, resign, and get rid of the pigs. The people had had it. The streets of Sofia became so loaded with angry Bulgarians that arguably somewhere an Ottoman general has rolled over in his grave, because over 100,000 people showed up for the first weeks of December 2025 every single night. And now, the protests were spilling out from the capital into other towns and cities throughout the country. This overwhelming pressure led to 2 things. First, it put immense pressure on the Prime Minister, Rosen, Zhelyazkov, to do something. And then when he recommended asking his cabinet to resign, that just pissed off the protesters even more. They wouldn't be satisfied until the entire cabinet had resigned. And that's exactly what happened. The government collapsed. On December 11th, 2025, the Zhelyazkov government would resign, acknowledging, quote, the voice of the people, end quote. And Mr. Zhelyazkov would go on to say to reporters in parliament, quote, our desire is to rise to the level of what society expects. We have heard the voice of the people who have been protesting. We need to meet their demands. And what they are demanding at the moment is the resignation of the government, end quote. And so it is then now that Bulgaria joins countries like Nepal and Madagascar in successfully overthrowing their current system of government. But I know some people are going to jump on me when I say that. I'm not saying it's the exact same thing. The difference here is that they didn't topple the entire organization, just the ruling cabinet. So this will then lead to March, when the next national elections will more than likely be held. The president, Boyko Borisov, will have to try and hold the parliament together until then without any major issues. Oh, wait, well, hold on. What's that? Oh, there have already been major issues. Oh, great. Fantastic. I couldn't even make a prediction then. Yes, folks, that's right. On December 17th, before we can even get this made and filmed, Parliament tried to pass the proposed 2026 budget bill that caused protests again. Like, they tried to do the exact same bill without changing anything. Just like the same budget. That may sound wild, but this wasn't the second time. This was actually the 4th time that they had attempted to pass the same budget without changing it, and the protests against it broke out immediately, with at least 50,000 pissed off Bulgarians jamming up the streets of Sofia again. An emergency session of parliament later, the MPs all decided that for their own safety, they better just pass the 2025 budget again instead of trying to pass the 2026 bill. So that's what they did. Absolutely incredible. Bulgaria is just being Bulgaria here, I guess. Anyway, the final complication in all of this is that Bulgaria was actually set to start using the euro on January 1st, 2026. Prior to this, they had their own currency that they had been using. All of this government instability will probably be rather concerning for the EU, but it also exposes a potential flaw in the EU itself as well. Because how can they let a country as corrupt as Bulgaria into using their currency, yet still claim that they would be tough on crime and corruption? The topic of the European Union and its approach to corruption is an interesting one, and if you would like us to make a video about that at some point in the future, we can research it in depth, but that is the issue here. But as it is, my friends, that's all the news about Bulgaria now. And yes, if you're curious about it, The Jolly Roger One Piece flag was in fact present in Sofia. I know I didn't mention that over the course of this entire video, but that was done. So I'm sure that, of course, that's going to go right into the thumbnail yet again. If we're going by the traditional measuring of seasons, then fall is technically over on December 21st and winter begins. So will the Gen Z fall end with this last successful attempt? Or will we just see more unrest as a Gen Z winter begins to take shape? Well, we will find out, and we will bring you back an update about that when or if it actually happens. But with that, my friends, we're going to be ending things here today. Thank you all very much for watching. I really do appreciate it. Let me know what it is you'd like to see here in the comment section, and I'll see you next time. But remember, my friends, once again, this video has been sponsored by Supremacy World War III. If you want to engage in intense PvP combat and conquer the world over a course of a matter of weeks in persistent combat, then by all means, click the link down in my description. Remember, new players get access to a free seasonal bonus pack containing the elite railgun unit worth around $40 US. Don't wait, click the link down in my description and go have some fun.